Hello, everybody. My name is Mizo, and I'm the Chief Technical Advisor of the Ship to Shore Rights Southeast Asia project at the International Labour Organization. It's my pleasure today to moderate this panel, Turning the Tide on Labour Standards in the Fishery Sector, Looking to the Pacific. I'm joined today by a distinguished panel of speakers whom I will introduce a little bit later. But first, I think it's important to say that we are here today to look at the Pacific because the Western and Central Pacific Ocean supplies approximately 60% of the world's tuna, and the exclusive economic zones of the Pacific Island countries cover half of the WCPO. Recently, labour rights violations and the need to protect fishers on the fishing vessels have come into focus. Fishing, as we have come to understand, is not only an environmental conservation or a fisheries management issue, but something that has people, fishers, at the heart of the enterprise. In 2018, the total value of the 7 most commercially important tuna species was estimated at $40.8 billion US. Fishes are at the heart of this multi-billion-dollar industry, but sadly, until now, they have received scant attention as actors and agents within the industry, and who make key contributions working in difficult and dangerous jobs. Fishing, we know, is one of the most hazardous occupations, and fishers don't have the luxury of going home at the end of the day. Many live and work on fishing vessels for extended periods of time, far away from regulatory monitoring or protection, far away from family and friends, and in isolation, often in the middle of the ocean. The ILO's Working Fishing Convention number 188 came into force in November 2017 and sets the minimum standards for living and working conditions for fishers. But many fishers live and work in conditions that fall short of these minimum standards. On the vessels fishing in the Western and Central Pacific Ocean and in the exclusive economic zones of the Pacific Island countries, there have been reports of labor exploitation, forced labor, human trafficking. Many of the fishers on these fleets are migrant fishers. They work on fleets fishing in oceans far away from their own home countries, and they often come from Southeast Asia or East Asia. At the same time, many of the vessels that are fishing in the Pacific Island country waters or EZ are not flagged to these countries, but fly the flag of other states. Despite these challenges, recently from the WCPO, there has emerged some important and innovative developments to improve working conditions on fishing vessels and to protect the human rights and labor rights of fishers. In 2018, the Western and Central Pacific Fisheries Commission passed a resolution on labor standards for crew on fishing vessels. And importantly, in 2019, the Forum Fisheries Committee, which governs the Pacific Island Forum Fisheries Agency, agreed to include crew employment conditions in its harmonized minimum terms and conditions, which apply to all commercial tuna vessels fishing in the FFA member states' waters. This is a significant step to link fisheries access with labor conditions of fishers, and I think moves towards very positively to an approach in fisheries management that really recognizes the role of the fishers, their need to be protected, and the potential that fishers become allies in fisheries management. But of course, progress is never straightforward. The COVID-19 pandemic has had varied and significant impacts on the fishing sector. Border closures, travel restrictions, inability to change crew, lack of access to healthcare, lack of space on board to observe recommended hygiene rules on fishing vessels have all increased the vulnerability faced by fishers. There is also a risk that disruptions brought by COVID may lead to private sectors to deprioritize efforts to safeguard against labor rights violations and to promote decent work. Yet, COVID-19 has also highlighted to us the importance of the fishery sector. Indeed, pandemic buying has led to a surge in the sales of canned tuna, canned fisheries products, as something that we all stocked during a time of crisis. So we have been reminded that fishes, among their many contributions, are also crucial to our food security. So this is a good time to discuss how we can protect labor rights and decent work at the center of the fishing industry, and really how to maintain the momentum of positive change in the Pacific in the post-pandemic recovery. So to tell us more about the efforts and achievements in the Pacific so far, as well as to really discuss some of the challenges and opportunities to come, I'm pleased today to welcome a distinguished panel of speakers. As you will see, the panel reflects the male-dominated nature of this industry, but each of them bring to us their deep knowledge and experience of working in the fishing industry in the Pacific. We are pleased to have with us a variety of perspectives on this panel as well, from national government, from regional governance bodies, private sector, and I hope the Fisheries representative who will join us a little bit later. But first, I would like to call on Edward Oniwala. Mr. Edward is the Director of Fisheries in the Solomon Islands Ministry of Fisheries and Marine Resources. He has had a long career with Ministry of Fisheries, starting in 1991 as a fisheries observer, and has since held a variety of positions, including Senior Data Officer at the Fisheries Statistics Unit and Deputy Director for the Offshore Fishery Division before he was in his current post. Edward, please tell us about the experience of Solomon Island government on these issues. What measures have been taken so far in promoting decent work and preventing labor violations in the Solomon Islands? And what are some of the key barriers there are to making progress? Thank you. The floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you very much, moderator, and good morning and good afternoon to you all. My name is Edward Honiwala, and I'm the Director of Fisheries for Solomon Islands. It's a privilege and honor for me to be part of this panel, and I wish to take this opportunity to thank the organizers for inviting me to participate in this forum. So thank you very much. Today, we are here to discuss a very important issue, the labor standards in the fishery sector. While many Pacific countries, including Solomon Islands, we rely much on fisheries for our economic development and livelihoods, there are lots of challenges and issues that are associated with the management of this important sector. Just to mention a few, we are aware of continuous IU fishing, unsustainable and over-exploitation in certain fisheries around the world. And again, we heard of slavery or abuses of human rights on fishing vessels, in particular for the crews. These are some of the issues that are happening around the globe and within our region. We are all concerned as these issues are real, and for Solomon Islands, setting labor standards for fisheries is important. We should acknowledge the hardworking crews on fishing vessels. They are the ones who contribute significantly to the development of fisheries, as well as our economies. For Solomon Islands, we support all the work and effort towards setting good standards for our crews, as well as for our fisheries. It is important that we protect the rights of hardworking crews on our fishing vessels, and especially those foreign crews that are working on vessels that are operating within our jurisdictions. Just to give you some brief background of the Solomon Islands, We have the tuna fisheries that actually consist of our local flag domestic vessels, which more than 90% of the crews are locals and work under our local labor conditions or labor act. On the other hand, we have the foreign fleets of fishing vessels, which more than 90% of the crews are foreigners. And in most cases, they work under their national labor conditions as they were recruited outside of our country. We also have some Solomon local crews that are working on foreign fishing vessels. But for information, they are recruited by the local companies or local recruitment agencies that are based in Honiara, Solomon Islands. So with this different fishing and recruitment arrangements, I think you can know or you can imagine the complex in terms of dealing with crews under different arrangements. So for Solomons, we have taken steps that will step towards addressing this issue, and also we will support any work that is in terms of trying to set fair labor standards in the fishery sector. So at the national level, the following has been taken at the national level. The Solomons Minister of Fisheries is currently working with FFA on our crewing policy. We started early this year, and we are hoping that our crewing policy should be finalized by the end of the year. As you heard earlier from the moderator, in 2019, the Solomons Minister of Fisheries, also part of the FFC ministerial meeting, they made a commitment that is for the FFA members to protect the rights of crews on fishing vessels. We also enforced all the fishing agencies that are responsible for recruiting crews in Honiara, that all those companies, they have to be registered with our ministry, with the Ministry of Fisheries and Marine Resources. This is where we can actually get some control over them. In addition to that, we also set the limits in terms of number of licenses allocated under these companies or these recruitment companies or agencies. We set them a limit in terms of the number of foreign fishing vessels that are actually allocated to them. So that would be also give us the control over those companies in terms of their fishing vessels that are operating in our waters. We also set the, in terms of unloading, they are required to unload in our designated ports. We have two, one in Honiara and the other one in Northern Western Province, where all our fisheries officers, they do port inspections. It's 100% coverage. So all vessels coming in, foreign vessels coming in, our officers have to board those vessels and they inspect those vessels. And listen to the crews, if any issues, they can raise to our officers. We have an MOU with them for their license period, and the license period is for only a year. And I'm just like to mention here that under their MOU and their license, the Director of Fisheries have the powers whether to suspend or to renew or to cancel. So if any issues arise, then the Director can use his powers under the Act in terms of the abuses that are happening in some of the boats. We have this Fisheries Observer Program, which is 100% coverage on the Pesenas, and a minimum of 5% on longline vessels. And as you're aware, the observer coverage on Pesenas and on the vessels in the region is now it's suspended. But on our domestic vessels for Solomons, we still continue with the overall observer coverage on our domestic vessels. However, for the foreign vessels, we still carry out 100% port inspection. So when foreign vessels comes in, we get the clearance from the Ministry, from the health authorities, and then our officers can board those vessels for inspection. We are currently doing e-monitoring on our longline vessels. We have around 70 vessels at the moment, and we currently install around 8, going up to 9 now, vessels with the e-monitoring. So with the e-monitoring, cameras were installed on longline vessels, and then when the vessels come in port, our officers will go and retrieve the hard drive from the cameras, and then they can analyze the footings in the office. So those are some of the measures that Solomon Island taken at the national level. And also, I wish to mention here that during one of our workshops towards our crewing policy, we found out that in addressing labor standard in fishing vessels or human abuses on fishing vessels, we really need a wider consultation. In our experience, we noted that most crews abused are foreign nationals that are recruited by overseas recruitment agencies. Found out that when crews they lodge their complaints to the captains or to the operators, vessel operators, they always refer them to their recruitment agencies. This is one of the complex issues we found during one of our workshops. Before I conclude, I wish to reiterate here that Solomon support any work towards setting labor standards of fishing vessels at the regional or at the international level. And at the national level, we are working on our new policy, new crewing policy, and I wish to say that some of these issues will be addressed in our crewing policy. So thank you, moderator. I'll stop here. Thanks. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for that presentation and for telling us about some of the initiatives and the challenges. I think one of the things you highlighted on the complexity of recruitment issues overlaid with flag state or port state and coastal state jurisdiction is something that we will discuss more later. I think this will be a recurring theme in the discussion today. Next up, I'm really pleased to welcome Tanuvasa Tuetu Lesi Peselele. He represents the Samoa Seafarer Association and Maritime Union. He has significant experience as well in the fishery sector in Samoa and across the Pacific. Like Edward, he has also worked as a fisheries observer and has skippered a Samoan research fishing vessel, has led maritime training, and has also undertaken specialized training on combating IU fishing. Welcome, Tanuvasa. As a representative of workers and as a union official, what are the key challenges you see that fishers face in terms of decent work and labor protections? And what role do you see workers' organization play to improve the working conditions on board? Thank you, and over to you.
Thank you very much for the opportunity to show ILO mediator. Good afternoon. My apology. We are all meeting on live from different parts of the globe. Lady Rodwell, FFA, panelists, excellencies, and the technical personnel behind all these speakers and gentlemen. On the behalf of Samoan Seafarers Association, I would like to take this opportunity to answer some of the two questions that was laid out already on our draft. First one, what are the key challenges fishers faces in terms of decent work? The question is, it's very challenging, and it brings a lot of challenges because we are in the this forum to look at the labor standards for these poor fishermen. Uh, in Samoa, we have an association for fishermen, and the challenge here, there is no association for the fishermen to address their labor needs up uh, to the competent authority. So right here in our national level, we are using, there is the management is already laid by the ILO and other UN international bodies, and it's which is the ILO structure, the tri-party structure, which the government is overpowering or overlooking the employers and the workers. So that's the big challenge us fishermen like to have is to establish a workers association. But when we look at the formation or the establishment of this kind of association, we have to go through a lot of procedures, a lot of legal procedures, and all the plus this is the association which has to make up the three numbers of the tripartite structure, which is the employers and the workers. The workers have a lot to say, a lot to voice out, but there is no association to take this through. So that's the big challenge. If we can do that in the near future, and I think this must be done, otherwise the labor needs of these poor fishermen will not be voiced and will not be competitive. So coming to the second question, what role can workers' associations, organizations play to improve working conditions? Well, this is the only this is the only role that workers' organization have to do here. This part of the WCPO is to establish an organization which can voice a lot of labor needs for these poor young fishermen. And I think if the employers and workers work together with the assistance of the competent authority, they're overlooking and see how these two uh, areas work out. I think we can manage to have an associations to address fishermen in the fishery sector. I think that's all from me right now, unless there are some questions related to these two questions.
Thank you very much. I think we'll come back to the questions, but the issues you raised, I think, is crucially important to our discussions today. The issue of the underrepresentation of fishes in discussions that really is about them is a problem, I think, a key problem in some of the efforts. I think the representation of fishes and workers' organization among fishes has being a challenge globally, not just in the Pacific. We see that there are barriers to organization, structure barriers and legal barriers, as well as practical difficulties in organization among fishers in all sorts of places, including Southeast Asia and now the Pacific. And I think there are additional challenges faced by migrant fishers when they want to organize and when they want to represent their views in various forums. ILO, of course, also has the two fundamental conventions related to freedom of association and collective bargaining, which is meant to ensure that workers everywhere have the rights to form their trade unions and collectively bargain for better conditions. And I think then we can maybe come back and visit, and I would be really interested to hear a little bit more later on about what exactly are the challenges in terms of organizing. Is it legal? Is it practical? Are there ways we can try to work around that to really see that we can build workers' power and workers' voice so that the issues we are discussing here today really has their views incorporated and integrated. So thank you for that, and I hope we come back to this point a little bit later on and that there will be questions from the audience as well. Next, I'd like to go to the FFA, which has already been mentioned several times by all of us in this conversation so far. Unfortunately, we don't have Len Rodwell with us today because there was an unexpected development, but we are very lucky to have Chris Reed to represent the FFA today. Chris is the Director of Fisheries Development, and because we didn't have time to get his bio, I did some quick Googling, and Chris, please correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe you hold a PhD in economics and you have co-authored many articles on tuna fisheries management in the Pacific. So thank you for joining us at such short notice today. We've already mentioned the couple of developments taken in the WCPO and by the FFA in particular, but we'd really like to hear a bit more about the experience of the FFA and what are the key challenges and achievements in the last couple of years through its initiatives. Thank you. Chris, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Lee. So first of all, I'll pass on Lenny's apologies that he couldn't make it. It was a family bereavement. So anyway, so he's got me to fill in. I'm not much of a substitute, but I'll try my best. Anyway, so just the where we're at, right? It's kind of fair to say that while things are moving in the right direction, the work on promoting decent work and preventing labour rights violations is a work in progress in the WCPO tuna fishery. For FFA members, this process began with the Regional Roadmap for Sustainable Tuna Fisheries endorsed by forum leaders back in 2015. And there was a goal with regard to employment, which stated that 18,000 new jobs will be created in the tuna industry within 10 years. While many of these will be in tuna processing in Melanesia, opportunities for nationals of all FFA members will be created for vessel crew, observers and fisheries management. Standards to ensure that employment is safe and worthwhile will be harmonised. So there's the first kind of step to getting safe and worthwhile employment. Following on from that, there was a crewing workshop that was convened in October of 2017 amongst FFA members. And in addition to the regional roadmap, another driver for the work was a recognition that while the WCPO tuna fishery is biologically sustainable, there is also a need that it is socially sustainable, to ensure that it is socially responsible. The workshop considered options for development of draft labour standards and agreed that one, there'd be an overarching regional framework that should be developed to address the issues. And second, that there was incorporation of labour standards in the minimum terms and conditions that might be a way to ensure compliance with labour standards. Three, labour standards could also be incorporated into licensing conditions and/or access arrangements. 4, ratification of the International Convention on Standards of Training, Certification and Watchkeeping for Fishing Vessel Personnel and Working Fishing Convention and the Working Fishing Convention would provide a basis for labour standards which could be put into access agreements and/or licensing conditions. 6, that national legislation would also need to be put in place. So following this, the next step was to take forward the recommendations from the workshop and develop a proposal for including crewing as part of the harmonised minimum terms and conditions of access for foreign fishing vessels, otherwise known as the MTCs. So they're basically a set of minimum conditions that's agreed across the region amongst the FFA members. The MTCs are a regionally agreed set of conditions that all foreign vessels must meet before they are licensed to fish in the EEZ of FFA members. Examples of other MTCs include the requirement to be on the FFA regional register of vessels, provisions relating to the vessel monitoring system, and a ban on transshipment at sea. The MTCs are a living document whose contents are reviewed from time to time. This PROSP, using the provisions of the Working Fishing Convention as a basis, was developed for consideration by the Governing Council of the Foreign Fisheries Agency, that is the Foreign Fisheries Committee. In May 2019, FFC endorsed the inclusion of an MTC to protect human rights and safeguard the labour conditions for crew. Following on from that, in June 2019, ministers committed to applying the crewing conditions to domestic flag vessels to ensure that a level playing field and full protection of the rights of the crews on fishing vessels against human rights abuses at sea. The key points covered in the crewing MTC are as follows. 1, a written contract in a language the crew member can understand. 2, protection of the basic human rights of the crew. 3, provisions requiring that crew are not assaulted or subject to torture, cruel, inhumane or degrading treatment. 4, procedures covering the death of crew and for advising next of kin in the event of an emergency. 5, full travel costs from the point of hire to and from the vessel at no cost to the crew. 6, decent and fair remuneration. 7, full insurance coverage to and from and on the vessel. 8, provision of medical care. 9, rest periods. 10, provisions for health and safety, including a safe vessel. 11, safety equipment and tools. 12, proper accommodation, sanitary facilities, and suitable meals and water. Approval of the MTC is the first step in the process. Implementation requires the development of national instruments to give effect to the MTC. The Secretariat has been working with members that have requested assistance in the national implementation of the MTC, including Fiji, Palau, Papua New Guinea, Tokelau, Tuvalu, Solomon Islands, and Vanuatu. Palau, Tokelau, and Tuvalu have completed implementation, with Palau and Tuvalu using regulations, while Tokelau has used licensing conditions. FFA has also recently commenced work in the Solomon Islands, as mentioned earlier by Eddie, and hopes to complete that work this year. In addition to the national instruments implementing the MTC, some countries have adopted to develop national crewing policies so that issues such as minimum crew wages and initiatives to promote the employment of Pacific Island nationals on vessels can be addressed. In parallel to the work being done via FFC, there is also work being done, led initially by FFA members at the Western Central Pacific Fisheries Commission. In 2018, a proposal by FFA members for a non-binding resolution on labour standards was approved by the Commission. This resolution broadly covers the same areas as the MTCs, but due to its non-binding status, Commission members and cooperating non-members are encouraged rather than required to take action. CCMs are encouraged to implement measures consistent with generally accepted international minimum standards for crew on fishing vessels, where applicable, to ensure fair working conditions on board for all crew working on fishing vessels flying their flag and operating within the WCPFC convention area. Despite being non-binding, the resolution did provide a framework for Indonesia to raise the issue of labour rights in the fishing industry in regard to a case of non-payment of salary of Indonesian crew working on a long-line vessel that caught into the port of Apia. This took place at the Commission meeting in December 2019. Several FFA members spoke in support of Indonesia and referenced the resolution, with Indonesia indicating it would seek to introduce a binding measure on labour standards for fishing crew. Indonesia followed through on that commitment with the 2020 meeting of the WCPFC and introduced a draft proposal, which is a draft CMM on labour standards, which would be binding on all members, WCPFC members. Given that the meeting was an online meeting with restricted hours and there was no chance to have substantive discussions on the proposal. However, it was agreed that an intersessional working group would be established to progress this issue. This intersessional working group is being co-led by New Zealand and Indonesia, and FFA members are preparing for participation in the working group. To wrap up, in terms of moving forward, FFA members have a bit of work to do in terms of increasing the number of countries that have put in place their national instruments to implement the crewing NTCs. However, additional work also needs to be done on monitoring and enforcing the NTCs, which will undoubtedly involve amendments to boarding and inspection procedures for vessels and training of fisheries and possible labour personnel, and probably the application of new technology to assist in detecting breaches of labour standards. In this regard, New Zealand is providing funding assistance to FFA totaling approximately $1 million over 4 years, with project implementation expected to commence in July of this year. Other participants in the project are the International Office of Migration as lead agency, the International Labour Office, and the UN Office on Drugs and Organised Crime. FFA members will continue to work with like-minded countries at the Commission to develop a binding measure on labour standards, noting that it is possible that this process will extend beyond 2021. When and if a binding measure is developed, monitoring enforcement will also be a challenge. Thank you. I'll leave it at that. And thanks to Len again.
Thank you very much, Chris, for that outline of FFA's important work. I think in the history you have outlined, it's important to note the development between non-binding resolutions towards something that is binding and the adoption of more stringent standards across the region. It's, as you said, not a quick process, but a process that requires continued push and engagement, negotiation and discussions. And I know that ILO is very pleased to be part of that process and to be a partner in the upcoming project to be implemented with the FFA. I think later on maybe we'll talk a little bit more about the challenges as the minimum terms and conditions become something to be implemented and enforced, and what the sanctions are for non-compliance and whether that can really drive change in the industry. So before I turn to our next speaker, I just want to remind our audience that if you do want to ask a question, please do so, and then we will be able to come to that a little bit later in the session. Depending on what platform you are using to watch this session, there are various ways you can use to send us a question. We are monitoring those platforms, and we will be able to see the questions you pose. So now I'm going to turn to Kiribati. It's my pleasure to welcome Mr. Kasoa Tonganibea. Kasoa is the president of the Kiribati Chamber of Commerce and Industries. He holds a Master's of Environmental Policy and a Bachelor of Arts in Marine Resource Management. He previously worked as the Director of Policy and Development Division of the Ministry of Fisheries and Marine Resources Development in Kiribati. So Kasoa, as a representative of the private sector, and we haven't spoken a lot about private sector's role today, so I think your intervention will be very important. So how do you think private sector can be engaged to promote decent work in the fishery sector? Thank you, and over to you. We are perhaps experiencing some technical problems, so I'm going to let it flow for a little while and then we'll see. So apologies to our audience. If you do have questions, this is a good time to ask them and we can have a look at them while we sort out the technical issues from Kiribati. Okay, so perhaps Kamal, I see you online and I wonder if you'll be ready to go next. Thank you. We'll go to our next speaker and we'll come back to Kiribati if we can, if the technology allows. And I think this is an excellent segue into the potentials and limitations of technology in this field. So Kamal Azmi speaks today on behalf of Global Fishing Watch, which is one of my favorite websites. Kamal is a senior research fellow at the Australian National Centre for Ocean Resources and Security at the University of Wollongong. And he works for Global Fishing Watch, which is an independent international not-for-profit organization dedicated to advancing ocean governance through increased transparency of human activity at sea. And for those of you who haven't looked at this website, it's quite fun and I encourage you to explore it. Kamal spent over 20 years in the Australian government working in international development, foreign policy and trade in the Pacific and East Asia. For the last 6 years, he has returned to university, not sure why, to complete a PhD in fisheries governance with a focus on Western and Central Pacific Ocean. So Kamal, how can new technologies be helping us in this area? We already heard from Chris a mention of new technologies. So what are some of the examples that can be applied here? And as we have seen, technology often goes wrong. So what are the limitations or unknowns and how can we work together really to improve the use of technology in monitoring human activity, but also labor conditions at sea? Thank you. Over to you, Kamal.
Many thanks, Mi. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening from chilly Canberra. It doesn't feel very much like it's in the Pacific today, a very cold day. But thank you very much, and thank you to the ILO for their invitation to Global Fishing Watch to participate in this panel discussion. It's a great honour and privilege. Mi, thank you for your introduction. Yes, fun is one way of describing the Global Fishing Watch website. Certainly, it is very interesting, and you can spend quite a while looking around on it. Today's topic, though, is a particularly serious one, and I'm honoured to be able to speak to it from the technology perspective. I will start by saying that technology is not the solution. It can contribute to solutions, but like we've just seen, technology is imperfect. I'd like to first just acknowledge the Ngunnawal people, the traditional owners of the land on which I live and work, and pay my respects to elders past and present and emerging. We've been talking about labour conditions, and I'm going to talk about a particular part of that, which was actually forced labour. And we know that whether it's crew conditions, forced labour, or the broader heading of modern slavery, it's very difficult to see what's going on at sea. You can board, you can inspect when they come into port, but while they're at sea, which is usually the majority of the time, we have very little picture of what's going on. You have a large number of vessels to inspect, a large marine space, particularly in a region like the Pacific, the Western Pacific, a large maritime space to watch. How do you know where to target your efforts? You've got limited resources and time, so you need to be able to target those resources to their best effect. So today I'd like to talk about the work that Global Fishing Watch has been doing to work out how to predict which fishing vessels are more likely to have forced labour on board by using satellite data. At Global Fishing Watch, as Mee said in her very nice introduction, we create and share map visualizations. We also manage data and develop analysis tools to enable scientific research and to drive transformation in the way we manage our oceans. To date, our main focus has been on publishing apparent fishing effort based on the use of a type of satellite data produced by what's called the Automatic Identification Systems, or AIS. And you can see the vessel tracks on our website on the public map that's available to anyone with an internet connection. You can look at that map and see vessels using AIS. AIS data is required to be used by large commercial vessels, primarily as a collision avoidance system. And that's required under IMO regulations and apply usually to vessels of a particular size, but many countries also mandate it for other vessels, including some smaller vessels. Global Fishing Watch applies machine learning to automatic identification system data, to AIS data, and we collect more than 60 million points of information per day. That's a huge amount of data. And we use that to determine, through machine learning, which vessels appear to be fishing, when and where they're fishing, as well as what type of gear they're using. We can look at their patterns, and the algorithms can recognise with a very good degree of accuracy whether they're, say, a longliner or a trawler or a purseine vessel. And we make this data, as I mentioned, publicly available. It's free, and it can be used by researchers, fisheries managers and coast guards to protect their fisheries and their marine ecosystems from illegal, unreported and unregulated fishing activity, or IUU fishing activity. AIS, of course, has its limits. It can be switched off, or it can be tampered with, so it looks like you're somewhere other than where you actually are. But we do have ways of detecting that, where there are gaps in AIS transmissions and where what we call spoofing, where a deliberate effort is made to add several degrees of latitude, for instance, to a GPS signal. We also employ other technologies such as visible light detection. We've used this to good effect with squid fleets. We also use radar and optical imagery as well. But AIS is the sort of the primary source at the moment. So as more evidence of forced labour in the seafood sector has come to light, we wanted to see if this technology could be used to contribute to a solution that everyone could use, that was open to everyone. So the research team at Global Fishing Watch partnered with the University of California, Santa Barbara. And sorry, I'm just going to, here we go. At the University of California, Santa Barbara, and with the team led by Gavin McDonald there at the university. And they looked into whether an analysis of AIS data cross-checked with risk indicators of forced labour could be used to predict risk of forced labour on board vessels. So this is using the similar technology to detect whether there was a risk of forced labour on board a vessel rather than whether there was a non-compliance issue in relation to illegal, unreported and unregulated fishing, or non-compliance with fishing regulations. So after 2 years of work, the research suggests that, yes, this is possible. The results suggested that satellite vessel monitoring data could be combined with expertise from human rights practitioners to predict risk at the vessel level. So it's important to note that this is a proof of concept at this stage. So it shows that it can be done, but it requires a lot more work, and I'll come back to that later when I talk about limitations. But a paper was, peer-reviewed paper was released in December 2020, and it outlines the full methodology and the findings. And that was in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Science, a very well-regarded peer-reviewed journal. with a combination of authors from Gavin McDonald's team at University of California, Santa Barbara, and our research team. So how did they do it? The team built a database of cases of fishing vessels publicly known to have used forced labour. So these were sources such as media articles by investigative journalists and so forth, and by NGO reports, and in some instances, embassies have put out press releases concerning issues of forced labour, particularly by those from countries that are major providers of crew. So the authors used the 11 ILO indicators of forced labour as the benchmark criteria for determining whether forced labour was present. So each of these cases that they looked at had to mention at least information on at least one or more of these criteria, of these 11 indicators of forced labour. So in addition to that, the vessel had to also be visible on AIS at the time that the reported use of forced labour was occurring. So you could see that vessel on our map at the time that that occurred. So this database was used to train the model, but there's actually an incredible shortage of data on forced labour. And so when we started with our large suite of incidents, and when you boiled them down to reduce them down to see which ones had AIS and which met at least one criteria for indicator of forced labour, we found 23 vessels with publicly confirmed incidents of forced labour. So I'm going to come back to that issue about the shortage of data in a bit later. So the study focused on forced labour. As it was thought, this can be observed through vessel characteristics and behaviours observable through satellite monitoring. Other human rights violations, such as the absence of decent work conditions, are much more difficult to observe through satellite monitoring. It's very difficult to, you can't see what a contract says or whether a contract exists by using satellite data, of course, but you can see certain behaviours. And we looked at 8 vessel characteristics and 10 vessel behaviours, and the team worked out which of those had the strongest relationship to forced labour using the sample data. And they found that engine power, daily fishing hours, average daily fishing hours spent on the high seas, the number of voyages, and the maximum distance travelled from port to be the strongest indicators. The authors predicted that vessels using forced labour would behave differently to those that don't. So, for example, by spending longer at sea and visiting port fewer times, meaning that crew were on board for much longer, had fewer opportunities to take a rest on shore and seek help on shore if they needed it. So in total, they found 23 vessels that reported cases of forced labour, and the model can differentiate between those that use forced labour and those that don't. The model was then applied to 16,000 vessels, and these were visible in the Global Fishing Watch system. And they used the model to predict how many of those 16,000 vessels behaved in a statistically similar way to the 23 in the training data set that was used to build it. And those were flagged as high risk of having forced labour on board. So to put it simply, the model can identify where vessels behave similarly to those known to have used forced labour. So of the 16,000 vessels that we looked at, the model predicted that around about 14 to 26%, with varying levels of confidence, exhibited the same characteristics or behaviours of those known to have had forced labour. So 14 to 26% of the 16,000 vessels. And that's a prediction. It doesn't mean that they did have forced labour, and it's important to recognise that this is just a probability, not absolute proof. But on those vessels of the 16,000, that 14 to 26%, that means that on board those vessels, they estimated that those vessels in total had a crew of about 57,000 crew, up to as many as 100,000 crew on those vessels. So if you went to the upper range, that's a huge number of crew who could be subject to forced labour. The end vision, of course, is that the model can be a tool that can be used by multiple stakeholders to assess vessels and provide an indication of risk. So flag states can use it to monitor vessels flying their flag. Coastal states can use it to ensure that vessels operating in their waters are complying with forced labour regulations. and they can prioritise boardings of those vessels. Port states, similarly, those that are not as fortunate as, say, Solomon Islands to have 100% port inspections can focus their port inspection efforts on those vessels that are seen as higher risk. The seafood industry also can use it to assess vessels throughout their supply chain, and civil society can also focus on those efforts to support improvements. So again, it's a tool that indicates risk to be used within a broader, comprehensive risk-based approach. So that's the end goal. But I'll just quickly touch on limitations. And I've already talked about risk, and I've said it a number of times, and it's really worth repeating, because that is the key limitation. It's not evidence; it's a probability. But so among those limitations, the model is not able to determine if a vessel has labour on board, as I mentioned. There may be legitimate reasons why it's exhibiting those behaviours, not necessarily because it's got forced labour. So there may be some false positives, for instance, and that's important to recognise that. And recognise the impact that false positives may have on that vessel and on the livelihoods of those crew members as well. The model can only cover certain aspects of forced labour that are observable by satellite monitoring. And as I mentioned, it can't look at contracts, at payments, at the retention of documents, or the right to collective bargaining, but it can look at what we understand to be forced labour as the ILO defines it. So I can't stress enough, this is not a solution that fixes all the issues, but it's intended to be a tool that supports the identification of risk to a competent authority or someone investigating their supply chain. There are gaps as well, and of course I mentioned earlier that I was going to return to the 23 vessels that we used in our training data. That is a very low number, and we need to improve this by increasing the number of vessels in the model. There is a bias as well, because we use media and NGO reports, that they do tend to be skewed towards certain flag states and certain gear types, and so we need to broaden this to vessels from around the world and different gear types. NGO media reports are often not verified by competent authorities as well, so that we do need to identify inspection and audit information from governments that will provide a greater level of assurance that what we're doing is accurate. And we also have a gap around what good looks like. So we need to add in behaviour by vessels that are known to not have forced labour on board, and to train the model to identify those vessels as well explicitly. So to do that, we need two things. We need more data, and so through vessel audits and inspections and so forth. And we need to ground truth the model as well. So we've got a prediction of those 16,000 vessels on our database. We've found a certain percentage of them have the same behavioural characteristics, but we need to really ground truth it. And we're aiming to develop a pilot of the model in a few port states to test this in the real world. And there are a number of requirements to do that, of course, and the other speakers have very nicely spoken to those, including the need to ensure that inspectors have the authority and the regulations to inspect against, and the authority to do that, as well as the resources to do it as well. We hope, though, that this tool will help them to do that and to be able to deploy their resources in as efficient way as possible to help to resolve this issue. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Kamal. It was a really interesting overview of Global Fishing Watch's work, and both the potential and limitations of data. It's very, I was struck by how you repeated that the data gives us probabilities, but not proof. And I think that's really important. And actually, the process you describe with the data is what in ILO language we would call a strategic compliance model, which is exactly that narrowing down of targeting so that we can do more effective inspections and not try to inspect every vessel at sea. So it's very exciting to hear that there are, despite the limitations, a technical model using satellite image and AIS that can give us that. And I'd be interested to explore, how we can improve the data. And I think it's important to understand data not just in terms of data points through satellite monitoring, but understand that also the testimony of fishes, inspection data, inspection findings are also data points that we can use, integrate, and triangulate. So thank you for that. I'm just going to check if Kiribati is back online and whether we can have our intervention from the private sector. I'm not sure. Can our host let me know on the system? I don't think so, but I'm not sure. Okay, I think Mr. Kasua is online. Great. Wonderful. So let us turn to Mr. Kasua, who is, as I said earlier, the president of the Kiribati Chamber of Commerce. And thank you for joining us today, despite the challenges of the internet. Please, my question to you is, how can the private sector be engaged to promote decent work in the fishery sector? Thank you. Over to you, Mr. Kasua.
Thank you very much. First of all, my apologies for the connectivity issues from this side. But thank you very much for having me in this virtual meeting. But before I respond to the question, let me first just give an overview, small overview of the current paper background Kiribati related to fisheries. So starting with the fisheries, in the past, over the past 50 years, Kiribati has put a strong reputation in international labor migration, mobilizing workers for merchant vessels, cruise ships, and fishing vessels. Around 700 Kiribati seafarers are currently working on German shipping vessels. And around 600 Kiribati nationals are working on fishing boats, including both from Japan, Taiwanese, Korean, the US, and so on. The Kiribati seamen or workers fishing boats are quite very skillful. They are being trained with the Kiribati Marine Training Center to work on fishing boats, and they can work safely to international standards, to work in harmony with other fishing vessel staff from a variety of cultural backgrounds. This is also potentially appealing to many foreign vessels who wish to invest directly through joint ventures with Kiribati. In 2012, the government of Kiribati entered into a joint venture with Golden Ocean for the development of onshore processing and commercial activities, supplied by long-line fishing activities in the Kiribati EEZ. This has been successfully resulted in investing more locally based fishing boats from partners like Spain, China, to recruit more First Nationals to work in the fishery sector on fishing boats. So the private sector is the fast-growing area in Kiribati, which is administered under the Kiribati Chamber of Commerce and Industry, and about more than 200 members of the chamber, and more than 50% of the members are based in Tarawa, the capital, are considered active in working closely with our department to achieve economic growth, providing opportunities for employment in the country. So the Kiribati government provides more than 6,000 employment opportunity for the Kiribati nationals as for civil servants, and the private sector alone provides about 11,000 formal jobs to establish commercial industries ranging from wholesale, retail, shipping to name a few, and 4,000 informal jobs through coconut copra cutters and domestic fisheries. So in essence, the private sector provides the biggest employment supplier in the country. So it's very important to promote the private sector to advance decent work in those sectors, especially the fishery sector is paramount important. So, as mentioned earlier, Kiribati has a strong reputation in international labor operation, mobilizing workers for merchant marine vessels, cruise ships, and fishing vessels. And this is all founded on strong existing national institutional, legal, and policy frameworks at the national level. Since independence in 1979, the government of Kiribati is quite particular in focusing on improving conditions of overseas laborers of Kiribati nationals, because in those days, government income from remittances from overseas workers were significant to support the national economy. So I'm quite very confident to know that over the years, Kiribati has adopted strong legal framework to provide good working conditions for Kiribati national working abroad fishing vessels. The Ministry of Employment and Human Resources Development in Kiribati has been receiving continuous support from development partners to support institutional strengthening processes and capacity to address labor mobility issues in the country and abroad. I'm happy to note that involving the private sector policy and decision-making process of the government is practically visible and attainable in Kiribati, where senior reps of Kiribati Chamber of Commerce and Industries are also members of the high-level decision-making platforms to address all issues of labor in the countries and the Ministry of Employment and Human Resource Development houses a decent work advisory board in which a rep of the private sector can play an important role in the decision-making process and involved in the development and review of labor-related policies in the country. So to ensure that all the private sector concerns related to private sector developments, including labor concerns, to be continually taken aboard by the government, the Kiribati Chamber of Commerce and Industries has developed the Kiribati private sector roadmap for the next 10 years. This document is still in draft, and we are still working closely with the government for adoption for the end of the year. This roadmap provides much emphasis on incorporating and aligning with the private sector in Kiribati. One of the key strategic actions for this roadmap is to develop a public-private sector think tank on fisheries development in Kiribati, improving partnership with the private sector and the government commercial ventures, and improving employment opportunities and decent work conditions in the fisheries sector would be the key priorities of this development. So I think this is all what I would like to share with you, and I hope to provide some good insight for Kiribati context. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Kausawa. Very interesting intervention from a private sector point of view, reminding us all that it is in many countries the private sector that creates the job opportunities required for fishers, and that they are really the engine of some of this economic change that we hope to see in many countries. It's very good to hear that Kiribati has a roadmap towards an expansion of opportunities in the fishery sector, and that it's looking to public and private cooperation in order to develop more decent work opportunities in this sector. So thank you very much to all of our speakers. I think there's a lot to discuss, but before we go to some of my questions, I want to turn to some of our audience questions, which have come up, and I'm going to break them down a little because they are quite complex, and there's a lot in one question. So for example, one of the questions, which is directed to the FFA, is about how the FFA can enforce, monitor and audit on vessels and work with CSOs to combat forced labor and trafficking. So as I said, there's quite a lot in that one question. I think I'm going to break it down a little and use my moderator's prerogative to direct it not to just FFA, but to also the Solomon Islands, to ask really how the FFA and as a regional organization and Solomon Islands as a country can enforce and monitor working conditions on vessels, and how you can do that in partnership, whether there is room for partnership from CSOs to look at trafficking and forced labor at sea. So perhaps we go to FFA first, and Chris, and then we'll come to Edward, if that's okay. Chris, over to you.
Thanks. I wish Lenny was here. Anyway, look, I mean, FFA itself does not enforce or do monitoring. We advise and help members set up systems by which they can do these things. So the FFA is an advisory body and helps the members put in their own national systems and the rest of it. So, I mean, I think Eddie touched on a few things that can be done. Obviously, port inspections and vessels come into port, inspect them. And the type of things, obviously, that Kamal talked about coming for the future. So it's all kind of, you know, as in monitoring, control and surveillance of any types of issues, it's all using a bag of tools which members will put in place. Obviously, a register of crew might help, so that the vessel owners have to submit a list of crew names and issues like that. But I'll hand it over to Eddie. He'll have more practical on-the-ground experience.
Thank you. Eddie?
Thanks, moderator, for the question. I think it's an important question. Yeah, in terms of monitoring of human trafficking on fishing vessels, I think the responsibility falls on the flag state and the coastal state. So, in my view, there should be some kind of partnership or collaboration between the flag state and the coastal state. For instance, the flag state is actually responsible for the vessel. Now, we have the fishing crews, which some of them are not from the flag state. They might be recruited from another country. And then the second part is, in terms of the coastal state, they move to another vessel, to another state to actually carry out their fishing operation. So it's to my in my view, I think there should be some kind of collaboration between the flag state and the coastal state, and as Chris mentioned, there are other tools which we should have in place. For instance, we have the port inspection, where for Solomons we really carry a 100% port inspection in terms of the coverage. So when the officers from the coastal state go on board, they can get first information from the crew themselves. Thanks.
Thank you very much for that answer. I'd like to follow up with that. So as you mentioned, the issues around fishing is particularly complex because of the transnational nature of the fishing. So often we find that the fishers, the fishing vessel owners, the operators, and the vessel itself belong to different nations. So they all have different nationalities. They're fishing in somewhere else altogether, and they might be recruited by actors in other states again. So the extremely sort of international nature of the enterprise is often a problem, because it allows different states to essentially say that the problem lies somewhere else, right? It's the flag state, or it should be the coastal state, or it should be the recruiting state, or the state where the migrant fishers come from rather than where they're working. So the origin state of the migrant fishers. So, and as Eddie has said, the coordination element becomes really crucial. And I think that's where regional fisheries management organizations like the FFA, like the WCPC rather, not the FFA, and FFA, which has its own role, become very crucial as mechanisms for coordination. Right? And the other thing I wanted to highlight was this comment about the importance of port inspections. We know that despite the excellent emerging technology that Kamal has highlighted, that at-sea monitoring remains quite an expensive and enterprise and is a challenge. But I think in the Pacific, there are particular opportunities here in two ways. One, there is the presence of observers on some vessels. I realize the coverage is not 100%, and there are on some vessels that are flagged to the Pacific Islands and not on others. But there is the presence of fisheries observers, which can provide some interesting data and information. And also, how do we then leverage port state inspections so that they really give us the information we need for conditions on board? We had a mention of interviews with crew, and in ILO's experience, interviews with crew are a wonderful source of information. But because fishers often have to go back on the fishing vessel they came from, they're often very reticent. It's difficult to get clear answers or a true picture of what's going on the vessel. And because there are fears of retaliation sometimes, and sometimes there are language and other communication difficulties if the crew doesn't speak the language of the inspectors. So I think there are a couple of challenges, and I'm not sure if our Samoan workers representative is still online. I can't tell in this view, but if he is, I would like to ask if Tanuvasa has any thoughts on the way we can improve crew interviews and incorporate workers' representation voice in some of this work. Not clear to me if he's online, perhaps not. But it also, I think, while we're talking about port state inspections, there is also a question that came from our audience about how grievance mechanisms work and whether fishers have access to grievance mechanisms in the Pacific Islands, and particularly during the COVID pandemic, whether that has been impacted. So perhaps from going back to the Solomon Islands, and perhaps to hear from Kiribati a little bit from a private sector point of view, how do you receive complaints and grievances, and how do you deal with them, and whether that's been impacted by COVID. So perhaps if we can go to Kasoa in Kiribati first, if that's possible. Okay, I'm told that's not possible, again, due to technical reasons. Edward, coming back to you, in Solomon Islands, is there a grievance mechanism in Solomon Islands? And how does that work for fishers who might want to raise a complaint, either because they're local to the Solomon Islands or because they're migrant fishers?
Thanks for the question. Yeah, in terms of grievances from the crew, for us, we don't have any standard mechanism in place at the moment, but we can still on ad hoc basis that should we receive a report from a vessel, then the director of fisheries has the power to actually do an investigation, and then even to the extent that using a provision under the act where he can suspend or even to the extent cannot renew any license of any fishing vessels. That is if we have a proof that something actually happens on board. Thanks.
Thank you. I'm told that Samoa is back online. So Tanuvasa, I'm not sure if you can hear me. If possible, I'd like to hear your thoughts on the way in which grievance mechanisms can work for fishers, whether there is one that you think is working well, or how you think we can best improve grievance mechanisms so that fishers can actually raise their complaints in a timely and effective way and have those addressed. Thank you. Over to you.
For the question. Do you hear me clearly?
I think we
Yes,
hear a little bit better now.
Yeah. Mechanism to improve what the fishers here are facing is that the very important thing is for fishers is to understand why they need to have an association. Not only that, but the legal framework to form the association for them. So, as I said before, the process is very long, but it needs a lot of fishermen to come together and work together because the fishers have a different perspective from the owners. Because some owners, they are in the association. There is association at the moment, but it is called Fishermen's Association. But there are most of the boat owners are in that association. But the thing is, they can't uh, voice out what the workers really want. But I'm glad that the Fisheries here is carrying out a lot of management measures for the management of the tuna and also the vessels. But when it comes to labor conditions, this is where it needs to have an association. And I think by doing these mechanisms will be very helpful, not only for the workers, but also help the employers as well to see where the workers need to negotiate with them in a legal binding framework in order to form and establish an organization for them. I think that's part of answering what you required. You.
Thank you very much for that answer. Again, I think highlighting the need for really organizing workers so that there is genuine representation of their voice and their interests. I think we have seen in many parts of the world, not just in the Pacific, that effective grievance mechanisms is one of the challenges. And to ensure, on the other side of that, remedies for fishers whose rights have been violated is also a challenge. And again, we heard about the complexity of the different stakeholders that are interested and have vested interest in the fishing industry, and how that can change access to complaint mechanisms, to remedies for fishers, and the importance really of balancing out those challenges with strong fishers organization and representation so that they have a much better position really to negotiate, as well as finding solutions to some of these issues. I'd like to come back to Kamal a little briefly, just before we wrap up. You talked about the need to really improve data and the plans in place, I guess, to ground truth the very high level technical data with some more, I guess, different data sources, which we sort of gestured towards, including workers. In your sort of view, what would be the best data model? What would be the ideal to improve the risk analysis that GFW currently has, and how can the people here today help you to get there? Thanks. Over to you.
Yeah, I think what would be the ideal model? I think it's always important to keep in mind that a model is just that. It's a model. So it is trying to replicate an impression of reality. It's not trying to recreate reality. So the more data we can put into the model, the more accurate its predictions can be. And so if we can expand to more gear types, so the model currently uses longline, squid jiggers and trawlers. We would love to expand that to purseine, for instance, and troll and other fishing gear types. Identifying more data that is verified by audits and inspections would be fantastic, and we have been assembling as much of that data as we can to continue to refine the model. But in terms of help, if anyone has access to that sort of data and is happy to share it, we can. We don't need all of the identifying information as long as we can match it with an AIS track. So without revealing the identity of the vessel publicly, we can do that. We would love to hear from people who have access to data like that and who have done inspections and can identify a link to at least one of those indicators of forced labour. Yeah, but it is really about data, and it's really about testing the accuracy in the field. Is the second element that I mentioned, and with a pilot. So working with port inspectors, but all those things that everyone's been talking about, and you summarised very nicely, is about the complexity of actually making that happen in a port or during a boarding and inspection operation. You need to have the appropriate regulations and the appropriate authority and jurisdiction to do that. The tool on its own is interesting, but it's really useful when it's backed up by the right institutional framework behind it. And that's what we love about what's happening in the Pacific with the FFA and in the project that Chris outlined with IOM, ILO, and UNODC is supported by New Zealand. I think that's a project that's really heading in that direction that I'm talking about. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kamal. I think it's important really to highlight that data is our starting point, and what we really need to see is enforcement actions on the ground, so that we can create a culture that encourages compliance and better labour protections, and where bad behavior and violations are actually punished and have sanctions and consequences. So thank you. We have about 2.5 minutes left, and as promised, I'm going to come back to each of the speakers to give you a chance for a rapid fire wrap up. So in a minute or less, please tell us the key message you want us to take away from today's session. I'm going to start in the order that we spoke in. So Edward from the Solomon Islands, please tell us your key message. Thank you. I don't think we can hear you.
Great. Yeah, thanks, moderator, and thank you, everyone. For Solomon Islands, as a country which we rely much on fisheries for our economic development and livelihood, we support the work towards setting good and fair labor standards for our fisheries. And we know that there are technologies which we can improve on this one. Now, this is an important area for Solomon Islands for tuna fisheries. We learn from other parts of the world that human rights abuses on fishing vessels occurs frequently and maybe increasing, and some of these cases can be very shocking. we want a fishery where everyone benefits from. That is from the fishers or from the fishermen to the processors and even down to the consumers. That's what we want to see. We want to see a fishery where everyone benefits and it's safe for everyone. So those are my concluding remarks, moderator. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I'm not sure if Samoa is online, Tanuvasa. If not, let's for now go to Chris from the FFA. Your key messages for us. Thank you.
Thank you there, me. From this discussion, I think what's coming out is that there certainly needs to be a framework at the national and RFO level to allow for action to take place. So you need to have something in place, some binding measures in place to allow for people to take action. Then on top of that, we've got to build capacity, particularly amongst the small and developing states, so that they can monitor and enforce it. So that's my key message, is we need to both put in something to allow action to take place, and then we have to develop the capacity of those who wish to take action to do so. Anyway, thank you.
Thank you for that brief and punchy key message. Much appreciated. Samoa is back online. I'd like to turn to Tanuvasa for your key message to us to take away today. Thank you.
Thank you. To summarize, my key takeaway message is that the system is already in our hands to promote, enforce, and strengthen labor rights and decent work in the fisheries sector. The United Nations, through ILO, ILS, and other international bodies for all nationals in the WCPO and Pacific Islands, to please let the ILO structure execute our way forward. I believe if the tripartite structure of governments, employers, and workers work together hand in hand to push our common goals, hope our beloved poor informal fisheries sector will be saved from violations. I urge our workers to stand up and establish association legally in order to complete the tripartite structure being laid down for us. Thank you, Partai.
Thank you very much, Tanuvasa. I'm afraid because Kiribati is still offline, we're going to skip over and go straight to Kamal. Please, your key message for us. Thank you.
Very much. I think I'd just conclude by saying that technologies like satellite vessel tracking data and machine learning and the forced labour risk model that I've described can play an important role in improving our understanding of what is happening at sea and in focusing the deployment of limited compliance resources. But it's not an entire solution. It needs to be part of a comprehensive risk-based approach, and it ultimately relies on humans. So inspectors who can use these tools to target inspections and verify compliance, and greater transparency brought about tools such as these can provide an incentive to vessel operators to do the right thing.
Thank you very much. And with that, I'd like to close our panel today. Thank you all for really interesting and rich discussion about all the challenges and the potentials, I think, that we see in this field. And I, for one, look forward to speaking with you all again in different forums as we move forward together on the issue. Thank you very much. And thank you for the questions to our audience. Thank you.